Okay. Just wait a minute for people to log on. There's always these kind of awkward bits at the start of a webinar when everyone's kind of sat there and you just see the numbers rolling in. So in the meantime, welcome everybody, those of you who are joining. In the meantime, we've got a Q&A function and a chat function down the bottom of your screen. So if you wouldn't mind, if you feel free to do so, to drop in whereabouts you're joining from. I'm up in Yorkshire at the moment. It's been a beautiful sunny day up here. Joe and Patrick, what about you? Where are you two? And Nadia, you're in Nottingham, I assume. Nadia, are you?
Oh, I wish I was. I'm in Westminster. We've got votes until like 11 o'clock tonight.
Oh, blimey.
So I'm camped out in my office.
Oh, it's going to be a late night. Paisley, very nice. Okay. Oh, Leeds. Leeds, I love Leeds. Fantastic place. Patrick, where are you? London?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
A nice day here.
Good stuff. Right, we'll just give it a couple of minutes before we get going. In the meantime, as well, what I'll do now is I'll share my screen. And okay, so this is the report we're going to be talking about today. It's the State of Hate report. This is free to download off our website, and I'd encourage you to go and do that after the webinar's ended. There is 140 pages of expert analysis, and it's really, really interesting stuff. So yeah, do go and check that out when you finish the webinar. Okay. Where else are people from? London, Surrey, Tottenham, very nice. Edinburgh. Oh, I had a lovely time in Edinburgh once. I've been up to Edinburgh. It's a great place. Glasgow as well is fantastic. Very nice. Very big fan of that. Okay, let's get cracking. My name's Nick Spooner. I'm an organizer with Hope Not Hate, and welcome to this webinar on the State of Hate report. Thank you very much for joining. This year the report is called Hate on the March Again, and over the course of this evening you're going to hear some expert analysis as to why that is our assessment of the state of the far right today. I say expert analysis, I'm not including myself in that. I'm talking about our superb panel that's on with us this evening. Before I introduce them, I just want to say that sadly, Rosie Carter, who's meant to be joining us this evening, she's not very well. She has COVID, so she's had to pull out this evening. So we send her our solidarity and our love and hopes for a speedy recovery as well. So if you get well soon, Rosie, if you're watching. But we have a fantastic panel this evening. And I'm delighted to welcome Nadia Witthome MP for Nottingham East, who's also a vice chair of the Hope Not Hate parliamentary group. Nadia, like Hope Not Hate, has been very critical of the police and crime bill, and has also been calling on the government to do much more in recent days over with refugees fleeing Ukraine. So welcome, Nadia. It's great to have you on. We've also got Joe Mulhall, who's our head of research at Hope Not Hate. Joe leads our investigations, our investigative research. And last year he put out an excellent book called Drums in the Distance, which I really recommend you go and read, about the global far right and some of the various undercover missions that Joe's conducted. And then we've got Patrik Hermansson, who is another researcher at Hope Not Hate, and he went undercover in the alt-right for a year and now looks predominantly at hate online. So thanks to all of you. Did I miss anything at all? Anyone want to jump in and add anything? No? Okay, good. So just a bit of background before we get cracking. So the State of Hate report is our leading annual report outlining the key trends and the changes in the domestic and international far right. And this year it shows how the past 12 months have led to an environment in which we're likely to see a return of far right activists back onto the streets, standing in elections and exploiting uncertainties created by economic hardship. What we've found worryingly is that after years in the political wilderness, the crises we've collectively faced over the past 2 years have emboldened cynical far-right activists to exploit our fears and uncertainties and return to traditional methods of campaigning as well. So the report predicts that the growing unease in society could be exploited by far-right extremists. There's some polling which Rosie was going to go into, but Joe has got the measure of, is going to give us some analysis of later, but shows that 80% of people now have less disposable income than they did a year ago, and 68% now believe that Britain is going in the wrong direction. It's a quote. So the State of Hate report this year shows how the far-right threat is pervading all aspects of our society, but also the steps we can take to stop blatant far-right rhetoric and conspiracy theories becoming part of normal discourse, and prevent fascists and extremists from dividing our society. So we've got a lot to get stuck into, and I'm really, really excited to hear from our panel. But I'm also very excited to hear from you as well. So just a bit of housekeeping before we get going. The first thing to say is, for those of you who weren't on at the beginning, is that this state hate report is free to download. You can head to our website and you can download it there. There's 140 pages of analysis, and it's well worth a read. So do go and check it out. The second thing to say is that we have a Q&A function enabled for the webinar. So if you have a question at any time, please do drop it in the box. And if I think it's really pertinent to what's going on at the moment, then I'll put it to one of our panelists. Otherwise, we're going to have a big section at the end of the webinar where we will take more broad questions, essentially. The other thing you can do with the webinar function, which I'd really encourage you to do, is you can upvote, or you should be able to upvote answers. I will check that function in a minute when we get going. But if you can upvote answer questions, then please do that, because it will encourage me to get to them a bit quicker. So please do that. Okay. So without further ado, let's get going. Nadia, I'm going to come to you first. You've been consistently outspoken about hate in the mainstream, and I'd love to come to you to sort of set the scene, give us a bit of a broader picture about the state of the country and what's your sort of perspective of the way in which hate has been mainstreamed in Britain today.
Hey, so I'm really sorry, but the division bell has just rang and I've got to go and vote. I did just direct message you. Sorry, you can hear it in the background again. But I'll plug my headphones in so I can listen to what everyone else is saying, and then I'll come back if that's okay.
That's totally fine. Yeah.
We don't get told when our votes are going to be, so it's...
No, this is the life of an MP. So yeah, you absolutely don't worry about it at all. If you're able to come back, that'd be great. But
thanks. No, I definitely will. See you shortly.
See you in a bit, Nadia. I've muted myself. Right, that's not a great start. Let's come to you then, Joe. So as I said at the beginning, this is a kind of broad overview. Sorry, the report is, it's very comprehensive analysis of what's happening in the far right at the moment. Why don't you give us some kind of big picture stuff? What are the kind of broad trends? What is the report about as a whole?
Yeah, so thanks, Nick, and thanks everyone for coming on. And I know kind of giving up an hour on a Monday night right in dinner time to talk about racism and fascism can be quite depressing. So we do really appreciate you coming on. And as Nick mentioned, Rosie, my colleague, was going to be on and has done some amazing work with her team around the kind of broader societal issues. So I will touch on them briefly, and then I'll kind of get into our bit of the report and the meat of what we were looking at. But broadly speaking, some of you may know, State of Hate comes out once a year. It's our big yearly report that basically says, this is what we've been monitoring within the far right the last year. Here are the trends we're seeing. This is what we're worried about. And this is the backdrop to the situation. So this is what society's looking at in relation to things like hate and discrimination. And part of that every year is a poll. We do a big poll every year, and that allows us to track. I mean, we do polling throughout the year, and that data work allows us to look at the kind of state of society a little bit. And the numbers are often concerning, and this year is kind of, I guess, no different. And just to run through some of them, so we asked various questions around people who experience racism, but also people's perception of society. And when we polled individuals from communities that experience racism, unfortunately, the numbers are really worrying. Half of respondents had witnessed racial abuse in the last year. 2/3 of people from Black and minority ethnic communities think experienced racial abuse in the last year, or think Black and Asian people face discrimination in their everyday lives. And then when it comes on to the societal question, over 57% of people are not satisfied with the way democracy is working in the UK. 74% people do not believe that politicians listen to them. Now, the reason that this is important is the far right prey on individuals and they prey on communities. They're not completely separate and detached from society. But I think too often we think about the far right as this tumor that hangs off the body politic. And if we can just lop it off, the rest of the body politic is fine. And actually, what this data continuously shows for us, and of course, if you ask people from affected communities, they'll tell you without the data, is that it's not just about the far right. There is a wider structural societal racism at play here. that the far right are, of course, part of, and they often whip up and they often exploit, but they're not necessarily always the sole driver. And, you know, I mean, we talk about in this beginning of the report at some length, some of our concerns about pieces of legislation, for example, the Nationalities and Borders Bill, the Elections Bill, various bits of legislation which essentially centralizing power, limiting opposition, and ultimately essentially increasing mistrust in the political system. When people don't trust the political systems, the bad things happen, in the sense that, as we know, and I'm sure you know, Nick, from knocking on doors and spending time in communities, often the far right will go into communities and say, no one listens to you, no one cares about you, but we do. And here's a simple answer to the complex questions you're experiencing. And when that many people agree that no one listens to them, I mean, that's clearly a failing of mainstream politics and mainstream political parties. But it means that we live in a very choppy and worrying climate where we're not saying in this report that the far right will exploit it, but there's certainly opportunity for them to, and in the past we know that they have. And then, of course, you throw into this 2 years of pandemic and the subsequent now or increasing cost of living crisis and energy prices. And while it's not a direct line between economic crises and the rise of the far right, it's much more complex than that, with cultural issues and all things thrown in. We know through lots of research that people are more susceptible often to far right rhetoric during periods of economic crisis. And so the background picture in some ways is quite worrying. And so I guess one of the things we do in the report, we talk about that at some length, and there's lots of detail about the polling. There's also whole sections on hate crime and the experience of individuals who are experiencing hate crime and what the numbers are showing there, which are of course very, very worrying and in certain cases on the rise. And then, as well as the kind of backdrop, I guess what Patrik and myself work on in the research team is the far right more explicitly, so the organized purveyors of hatred. And our job is to essentially understand what are they up to, where are they going, and where do we see them going in the future. And so I guess the bulk of what I'm going to touch on now is our analysis of where do we see the British far right and where do we think it's going. So there's a number of trends, right, that are worth touching on. All of this is worth saying that obviously for several years we've experienced a pandemic where many of us were locked in our homes. And for that reason, the far right were locked in their homes, generally speaking, as well. And that in some ways limited certain types of far right activism. It limited all things, including far right forms of activism. And of course, over the last year, as lockdown restrictions have eased, the far right, we've seen them return to the streets in significant numbers, and we've seen them start to organize again in our communities. Now, certain far right groupings organized continually through the pandemic, especially online, and certainly the organizations that were perhaps younger or more tech savvy, if you will, continue to organize online and continue to operate despite the restrictions. Some of the older, more traditional groupings almost went a bit by the wayside and kind of sat out of this throughout the pandemic. In the last year, we've started to see the return in various ways. So I guess the big three groups I'd kind of flag at the beginning of this is one is a fascist organization called Patriotic Alternative, led by Mark Collett, who used to be a prominent figure in the British National Party. It's been around since 2019. And I'll post the kind of, I say post-pandemic advisedly, I guess, post-lockdown restrictions, or the really strong ones, we've seen a huge amount of on-street activism by this organization. During the pandemic, they did do some. They had marches, as I said, some hikes, etc. But we're now monitoring probably every weekend 5 to 10 activities by this group around the country on the streets. And that could be leafleting, that could be knocking on doors, that could be demonstrations, that could be hikes, that could be gaming events, etc. Extremely active organization. And at its most extreme elements within this party, they are very extreme, explicitly anti-Semitic, Holocaust deniers. There is talk within there in the ranks about violence and revolution, etc. So it's a very worrying threat. And its last kind of major event was in a hotel just a couple of weeks ago, and there's 150 people there. A slight decline to the previous one, which was public, which had over 200, but it had prominent Holocaust deniers like Michelle Renouf speaking. So they're back out on our streets and in our communities many weekends. Another one I just wanted to highlight at the start was Britain First. For anyone who's been interested in this world for a while, they will have heard that name for many, many years. An anti-Muslim street movement run by Paul Golding. This party has now registered as a political party, and we've started to see, again, large amounts of activism. We've seen it create a properly national structure in the way that it operates, and we're seeing especially strength in places like the Northwest, and we know they're standing in the upcoming local elections in the Northwest, in Wales and in London. Very, very active, often leafleting sessions and door knocking sessions that can have 10, maybe 15 people. They've had some sort of demonstrations that have had over 30, 40. They have 3 minibuses now. So again, a very active threat that is back on our streets and our community. And then finally, I guess the top grouping out of this in terms of the most active on the streets is Tommy Robinson is back. Many of you will know Tommy Robinson, real name Stephen Yaxley Lennon. He's had a number of years which have been a real disaster for him, which has been good news. He has been tied up in legal concerns. He's been lost various court cases. He's been imprisoned, etc. We've really seen him return to the streets in the last 3 or 4 months, towards the end of last year. He had his big comeback demonstration in Telford about on-street grooming by gangs in late January, where he produced a documentary called The Rape of Britain. And he has a series of those, and he's really focusing on Telford. And just last week, he joined the anti-Muslim political party For Britain. So again, we'll be taking that activism and taking it to more formalized structures. So in its traditional sense, the far right in many ways looks very traditional at the moment, in that while it remains very small and very splintered, there's lots of organizations. None of these groups are large enough to dominate the whole wider far right, say in the way that the BNP did previously. We have a number of decentralized groupings, but they are back on the streets and they're back in our communities. And that's something that we need to think about. The other thing I'd touch on early on is anti-migrant politics, as you'd expect, has been at the very forefront of far-right campaigning in the last year. So for numerous years previously, Brexit was a preoccupation across the far right, ranging from Nigel Farage all the way up to the most extreme elements. Talk around Brexit was key. Throw in then, of course, talk around the pandemic and COVID conspiracies and theories, etc., dominated a large amount of that rhetoric. Anti-migrant activism from 2019 onwards has become a real central thing. And much of this activism is being done by a small group of so-called citizen journalists, they would call themselves, or migrant hunters, which create social media content, film migrants arriving on the South Coast. Our estimates put it around last year, there was about 126 far-right actions outside hotels where there was accommodating migrants. So again, back on the streets, really active in and around our communities. And in this sense, doing some really nasty stuff where it's like intimidating and turning up at the accommodation of migrants and asylum seekers. One of the interesting things I'll touch on, I guess, in a second is how much of this has been mainstreamed, and migrant hunting is an important one. So I'll come back to why that's important. Now, as well as we talk at length about how the far right essentially are much more active in our streets and on the communities at the moment, we've also seen a worrying development online in the last year. For the last 5 or 6 years, Hope Not Hate has worked very, very hard at what's called deplatforming, which is removing far right figures from major social media platforms when we believe they're breaking the terms of service, engaging in racism or harassment or talk about violence or terrorism, and pushing the tech platforms to be more proactive in removing hateful characters with mixed results, I would say. The platforms have had mixed results, but generally speaking, in recent years, they've increasingly got better after things like Charlottesville in America, and after various pretty disastrous events. They started to take action against far-right figures. And so major figures like Tommy Robinson, etc., and Britain First, Britain First had 2 million people on Facebook, Tommy Robinson had 1. They were taking off these major platforms that severely reduced them. And what we've started to see for many, many years now, back to maybe 2013, 14, is the far right attempting to create an alternative social media space. That is social media platforms, not Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and those ones, but alternative platforms that had lighter moderation or ones they created themselves. We always called these either co-opted platforms. So these can be social media platforms like Telegram, for example, that while not created by the far right in any way whatsoever, have very lax moderation policies around terrorism and hate speech. And so we've seen people move to those platforms. We've also seen the far right attempt to create their own platforms over the years where they control the mechanisms of themselves. Now, the good news for us has been that for many years, those platforms didn't really work. The functionality of them was poor. And also there were these small little echo chambers and very few people were on them. One of the things we highlight in the report this year is there is an increasingly viable alternative social media space. When possible, the far right continue to use all platforms simultaneously, but for different purposes, if possible. They will still use Facebook, YouTube, Twitter. That's where they can reach most people. But if they can't, they'll be on Telegram, etc. But we also have now platforms like Getter or Odyssey, BitChute, and Gab, while they have much smaller numbers than the major platforms, some of the far-right figures in the last year or so have begun to develop followings on them that are significant. So Tommy Robinson, for example, well over 150,000 on Getter. This is still a far cry from the days of Facebook and Twitter, so I'm not going to say that it's a disaster. We still prefer them to be there, but the alternative space means that one of the key tactics of the anti-fascist movement and progressive movements has been deplatforming, and that's becoming increasingly or decreasingly effective, because the ability to marginalize these individuals from public discourse is becoming less and less as they find alternative spaces online to organize and operate. And then another big thing we highlight in the report is the conspiracy theory scene. Now, those who saw State of Hate last year, it was a huge part of that report, and it still remains a large part of the report this year. One of the things we highlight in this year, which is really worrying, is the radicalization of the conspiracy theory scene. So over the last 3 or 4 years, obviously large numbers of people have engaged with conspiracy theory content. That could be anti-lockdown stuff, it could be COVID conspiracies, it could be anti-vaccine stuff, it could be all these various things. And we've talked about demonstrations on the streets with 10,000 people on listening to David Icke and those sorts of things. So the scene has been a worry for a while, of course. But what we've increasingly seen as lockdown restrictions have eased, in some sense, this movement has got smaller because there are fewer people getting involved in a conspiracy theory groups, etc., and demonstrations, because the anger that mobilized it, like the lockdown, has dissipated. However, what we have seen is some of the individuals who have continued to be involved in this essentially have gone further down the rabbit hole, right? And by that, I mean, there is such a thing as super conspiracies, which is essentially when you bundle together multiple conspiracies in a hierarchy. And once you have this super conspiracy, it demands a conspirator, right? And invariably through history, we know that the conspirator is deemed to be the Jewish people. And so there are worryingly large numbers of people that got involved in anti-lockdown politics or maybe anti-vaccine stuff online that have gone further enough down that radicalization pathway to believing in some sort of grand conspiracy, whether or not that's the Jewish world conspiracy or the New World Order, QAnon. And that's really scary for those people, right? Because all of a sudden you go from being annoyed about something like lockdown to all of a sudden believing you've had your eyes open to a grand conspiracy that the world is secretly run by a pernicious force. And that belief system can, in their eyes, legitimize more extreme action. And so we've seen groups like Alpha Men Assemble and groups that have started to take on much more vocal, direct action sort of politics. We've seen that outside attacking journalists and the offices of journalists. We've seen training and those sorts of things. Essentially, the movement might be smaller, but going forward, it's getting more radical. And that's something to really, really watch out for. And it's something we're really concerned about. And then within that is this rise of the sovereign citizens idea, this kind of pseudo-legal language and text, which we've seen wrapped around the movement that many of you will have seen on your kind of bus stops and the like. And then I guess one of the things I'll finally touch on is the mainstreaming element of this. There's two things here. There is the mainstreaming of far-right individuals, and then there is the normalization of far-right rhetoric. And I think sometimes we confuse those. We have examples, for example, like The Spectator and a very large magazine writing puff pieces about Zemmour in France, or continuing to platform individuals or give jobs to individuals at The Spectator, some of which, like James Delingpole, are explicitly working with the extreme far right in the UK now. So this kind of cordon sanitaire that is supposed to keep the far right out of mainstream discourse, in some cases has crumbled. And we saw that with things like migrant hunters on talk radio. And we've, of course, seen that in numerous examples with GB News, far-right individuals and figures entering the mainstream. But we've also seen a normalization of far-right rhetoric, which is where essentially the ideas and language of the far-right enter the mainstream. The best example of this, of course, was Boris Johnson at the dispatch box talking about Keir Starmer attacking him around, saying he failed to prosecute Jimmy Savile. Now, anyone who monitors the far right over the last year or so will know that this is a rumor or a piece of disinformation that emerged out of the far right, that essentially worked its way up to the point where, I'm not saying Boris Johnson was sitting there reading Tommy Robinson's telegram. That's not how this works. It happens osmotically. It builds through the movement until it breaks out of the far right. But we see this thing where we see far right rhetoric entering the mainstream. And another example of that is the migrant hunters, the language of the migrant hunters being echoed by some of the press releases we saw from the Home Office about gunboats in the Channel, and some of the language we see about the way we treat migrants and refugees. Again, we're seeing rhetoric that sounds indistinguishable from that of the far right in mainstream areas. And then the very last thing I'll just cover before I hand back is I thought it'd be briefly worth touching on the far right in the UK's reaction to Ukraine, as everything that's been going on there. Now, I will say all of this is that the far right's involvement in the UK in this is an irrelevance in the grand scheme of things. So I understand why this might look like navel gazing, but I just thought it would be interesting to say, what are the far right here saying? And broadly speaking, the far right is split actually on Ukraine. They've found it quite complex. For some people within the far right, or large sections, Putin's authoritarianism, his illiberalism, has made him a bit of a darling of the European far right for the last few years. They talked about him as a protector of the West, as a protector of Judeo-Christian values. So for those individuals, some of them have been torn, right? So on the one hand, many of these people have kind of come out of this kind of slightly unshakable Cold War dichotomy, and they have slipped straight back into that. And it is the West versus Russia. So for some people in the far right, it's very simple. They are, it's gone back into those almost 1980s Cold Warrior stuff. And this is something we've seen with a lot of the Republican movement in America as well. For other people, though, in the movement, in the far right, there is this kind of such a deep-seated mistrust of the mainstream media, of politics, of politicians, of mainstream reports from the BBC, that they just disbelieve anyone who is mean about someone else, my enemy's enemy, if you will. And so those people have defended Putin. And these individuals often see Putin and Russia as a counterweight to American imperialism and liberalism. They see his kind of pushing back against NATO as a positive. They see his anti-Western rhetoric as a positive. And they see him as like this bulwark against globalism, which they disagree with. And for many of these, of course, for them, they will see this as being pushed by a Jewish kind of conspiracy underneath. So you do have those then, of course, that have been very, very pro-Putin. With the more extreme elements, say in some of the Nazi groups we monitor, this is just a tragedy because it's two white nations fighting. Right, so you can throw that element into there. This is a conflict, and this is nothing new in the far right. When they talk about the Second World War as a brothers' war, they see this in the same way. And then, of course, you have this other outlier, which is far right groupings who are very pro-Ukrainian in this battle, and this goes back to their involvement or their veneration of the Azov battalion, which is a kind of neo-Nazi battalion in Ukraine that's been active in the anti-Russian work since 2014. And this has been something that's been a big excitement for the global far right and the global neo-Nazi movement. And so some people have fallen into line and seen this as about self-determination of Ukraine, etc. So there is a diversity of views there. The one thing I would say, of course, is the Azov battalion are now awful, but estimates place it around 900. So in the grand scheme of this wider war, it's a tiny element. And so I've just got a police car going past as a wider part of this. And so we need to be very careful about individuals that say Azov battalion is a legitimization for Putin's action, which I don't think is the case at all. So across the far right, there is a diversity of views, is what I'd say. And so there's a very broad overview of the things. The other thing, of course, which is fundamentally important here is the much more explicit neo-Nazi scene and the really worrying far right terrorism, which my colleague Patrik will cover as that's very much his area.
Thanks, Joe. We've had some great questions in already, so there's some I'm going to have to save for the end, but there's some which I think I want to come to straight away, if that's all right, Joe, just very quickly, if you have a minute. Also, welcome back, Nadia. Great to have you back. A couple of quick questions. One from Nikki, who says, who finances these far-right groups? And another one from Jenny, who says, are you seeing activity UK-wide or concentrated in specific areas?
So on the first one about who funds it, I mean, it's a difficult one in the sense, understandably, we're all looking for everyone that there might, is there some secret, shadowy, big businessman pouring money into the far right? And while there are examples like Tommy Robinson receiving money from the Middle East Forum in America, and you do get these examples of wealthy individuals doing occasionally, the vast majority of the far right, first of all, operates on very small budgets, actually. Most of the organizations, most of their activism is confined to leafleting, etc., and it doesn't require huge amounts of money to print thousands of leaflets, and when they have things like events and conferences, they sell tickets themselves. So there's not kind of like these grand schemes that they require vast amounts of money to do their activism. And actually most of what we see, even when we see large things happen often, they're crowdsourced from within the movement. So all of the individuals involved crowdsourced. Tommy Robinson is the grifter of all grifters. He calls for donations endlessly and constantly, and it's £5 here, £10 here, and sometimes you will get individuals that will give more. But, the same goes for lots of these groups. It's very small levels of money. Now, of course, they manage to attract not just money from the UK, but globally. And so often these individuals, people like Tommy Robinson, are well-known figures within the global far right. And so their calls for financing can come from all over the world. And that can result in very, very large amounts of money. But I guess what I'm saying is I think it'd be wrong to kind of presume that there is like one or two. It's not like the Koch brothers, what we all think about in like America. They obviously do fund all sorts of terrible stuff. But most of the British far right is not that there is not some secret sugar daddy. Most of it is crowdsourced, and most of it is done on relatively low budgets. And then in terms of where it happens, well, this is a really difficult one. So most of what I've talked today about is quite traditional far right activism. So Britain First, For Britain, etc. And these groups have localized strongholds. So, we'll see, we know For Britain has got a strong grouping in Essex. We know that, and it's been very active in Hartlepool, for example. Britain First has been very active in the Northwest. It has some stuff in the Midlands. And we know that we can map out where Patriotic Alternative has its strongest branches and where they have their most activism. So you do get those traditional organizations being very localized, but a big element of modern far right activism is what we call post-organizational, right? And this is thousands of individuals around the world engaging in far right activism online, outside of the confines of traditional organizations, perhaps best visualized as almost like a school of fish, that they move together at times, but then separately at others. There's no leader, there's no structure as such. They use all of the mechanisms of the online space to organize around. And these individuals can affect people all over the country without not necessarily even being in the UK. So we can see young individuals or individuals in the UK, being radicalized in Stoke, but they're consuming content from Australia or Germany or America, and vice versa, by the way. Or they might be operating and engaging with other far right activists in the UK through watching content, for example, and they don't even know who the person is making the content because there's no picture. So as well as these traditional groupings which affect our communities and our streets, really the best way to understand far right activism nowadays, of course, is we also have to go beyond that, beyond just our local community, etc. It's not as simple as saying the National Front's strongest branches were or are, as you might have done in previous years. While that does happen with PA and Britain First, you can also get individuals that are radicalized into very extreme behavior, very violent behavior, and they could be anywhere in the country and have no formal connection to any grouping or organization whatsoever. And it doesn't mean they're not going to go out and try and commit a terror act. But they've never joined anything in their life. They've consumed content from all over the world. So it's much more complex than that in terms of saying where in the UK. The danger now is that it can be anywhere in the UK at any time, and it will be almost impossible for people to find out who it is often. So it's a combination of the two.
Thanks, Joe. Some important analysis there. Thanks to everybody else who's put questions in. We've had some really, really good ones. I'm going to have to move on just because of time, but at the end we'll circle back and we'll hopefully get some of these questions in. Nadia, I'm going to come to you. Great to see you. Great to have you on. Thanks again for coming back. You're going to talk to us a little bit about the state of hate in the mainstream and a bit about structural racism in the UK. Where do you want to kick things off with this conversation?
Sure, thanks so much. And to those of you who joined shortly after we started, I'm sorry that I'm late. I was joining on audio because we'd been called down for a vote. I firstly just want to start by thanking the Hope Not Hate staff for all of your tireless work that you do to expose the far right in this country. It's so important for us to understand how these movements operate so that we can counter them effectively. And this report raises a number of very important trends, from structural racism to the mainstreaming of the far right and COVID conspiracy theories. So I'll start on structural racism and the state. We saw last year and the year before last movements like Black Lives Matter, like Kill the Bill, that sprung up, and they sprung up in response to the actions of the state. So while far right social movements are definitely a threat that we shouldn't underestimate, we also can't forget the racist violence that people of colour in this country experienced already at the hands of our legal, political and economic structures. So many people of colour in Britain are confronted with this structural racism in their day-to-day lives. Some concrete examples of this would be measures like Stop and Search and Prevent, which disproportionately target Black people and the Muslim community. It's about the hostile environment that erects barriers for those with a migrant background to access to healthcare, to housing or welfare benefits. It's the disproportionate numbers of children of colour who are excluded from education. And that is how many people of colour experience structural racism in Britain every day. And then when we look at the government, despite its assurances to address racism in our society after the Black Lives Matter protests, this government, unsurprisingly, has clearly failed to keep those promises. The Tory party even sacked one of its own ministers, Nusrat Ghani, allegedly for being Muslim. And they've so far failed to address the whole host of complaints around Islamophobia in the Conservative Party. And then when we look at their legislative agenda, that also points in a very worrying direction. So as I think Joe mentioned, there's the elections bill, which kind of further goes to deepen people's distrust in our democracy and in our political institutions. But there's also the Nationality and Borders Bill, the policing, the police crime sentencing and courts bill. And if we want to fight racism, it's absolutely vital that we fight back against those pieces of legislation, because the impact that those bills will have on minority communities will be severe, and the narratives that go with them and propel them will only serve to further embolden the far right. So in that context, I wanted to highlight particularly the impact of the policing bill on Gypsy, Roma and traveller communities through criminalising unauthorised encampments. The bill would impose more police brutality on members of the community living in trailers or in caravans. It could lead to people having their vehicles seized by police and potentially even facing prison sentences of up to 3 months. Now, that's clearly completely unacceptable, especially as we already see that GRT people are already too often the target of hateful campaigns that are trying to chase them away from campsites, exclude them from local communities. And honestly, I think no political party is taking the structural racism that Gypsy, Roma and traveller communities face seriously enough at the moment. Then on mainstreaming of hate and the threat to democracy in the UK, I think what this part of the report shows us is that it's not just fringe politicians like Nigel Farage who are feeding those dangerous narratives about minorities from outside Parliament. Racism is systemic. It's already part of our legislature. We don't need people like Nigel Farage to patrol the Kent coast if we've got MPs like Natalie Elphicke posting videos to her Twitter claiming that refugees are breaking into Britain whilst posing next to a dinghy. And that fear-mongering, that legitimises existing far-right movements who are using the channel crossings to attack migrants' rights. And I'd also say, and Joe mentioned this as well, that it's not just politicians who are helping to mainstream hate, it's media coverage that plays a role in that as well. So for example, GB News, Spectator, parts of the Telegraph have all platformed those voices, or, you know, we see every day in parts of the media, the right-wing media, this sort of hateful language and fear-mongering. We've also seen, and I think this is not just kind of exclusive to parts of the right-wing media, but also parts of the media that would usually be considered to be quite mainstream and sort of centre-left. But there's been a huge increase in hate crimes against trans people, and that's happened at the same time as there's been an explosion of negative coverage of their lives in the press. We've also seen hate incidents against Gypsy, Roma and traveller people peak following negative media coverage. And I think what editors need to understand, and perhaps they probably do understand, but what they put into their papers can have very real consequences for the communities that their journalists and their commentators target. So, for example, another example that Joe mentioned, but the flippancy with which Boris Johnson took a smear that originated in the far right about concerns about Keir Starmer and used that to attack Keir Starmer in Prime Minister's questions. And in doing that, he not only risked Keir's safety, he not only emboldened those far-right activists who mobbed Keir Starmer and David Lammy outside Parliament, but he also made a mockery of very serious issues, the issue of sexual abuse and child abuse. And yeah, I mean, it goes without saying, I can't believe that it needs to be said, but that is an issue that people shouldn't be using to score cheap political points. I think the wider sort of a continuation of that point is that disinformation has consequences and it erodes people's trust in political institutions. So I think the report said that that faith in our democracy is currently at an all-time low, and over half of people do not believe that democracy is working in the UK. And I think that a lot of us would agree with that, at least to some extent, but our solutions are different. So we have to be putting forward those solutions, because at the moment, when there's that erosion of trust, that makes it much easier for conspiracy theorists to recruit people, to get people into their fold, and to poison their minds with this far-right rhetoric. So to conclude then, I think what the report shows us is that there isn't just one separate sphere of influence that the far-right exercises its power in. There are multiple different factors that come together to create this environment where conspiracy theories, where the far right, where anti-democratic politics thrive. And at the moment, we have a political and a media elite that simply isn't accountable to the people. I think as well, which I'm sure other people will go into more detail in, but people are still suffering from the effects of the pandemic, from the long-term economic, but also psychological impacts. And at the same time, the NHS remains underfunded. Basic living costs are rising, benefits have been cut, wages for most workers have been frozen. So our political system is clearly in need of reform to ensure that people feel more connected to democracy and to democratic institutions. We've got to invest in our communities instead of pushing through further funding cuts to local authorities, to community centres, to health services, benefits. And it's only through bringing communities together that hope can triumph over hate. And that's why I hope that people will engage with Hope Not Hate's community engagement programmes. They're so important. And it's exactly those types of initiatives that will help make our communities more resilient to resisting the far right.
Thanks so much, Nadia. It's really, really good to hear your analysis on this. Just quickly, I've got a question for you. You've obviously in recent days you've been very vocal about the government's position on refugees fleeing Ukraine. What do you think this country needs to do more of? What do we need to do better in order to meet the needs of those who are fleeing this terrible war?
I think when people are fleeing war, they shouldn't be made to jump through hoops and to get through lots of red tape to reach safety and to be reunited with their loved ones. The government schemes fall far short of what's needed. We need to waive all visa requirements. But the problem with that the Tory party will face, and also parts of the Labour Party and other parties will face, is that if you say waive visa requirements for Ukrainian refugees, then what about other refugees? And to that, I would say we should be doing the same for them as well. And in fact, I wrote recently with my friend Zoe Gardner, who works for the JCWI, that's the Joint Council for the Welfare of Immigrants, about why this was before Putin's invasion of Ukraine, but I think that in itself has highlighted the brutality of our border regime. We really need to be moving towards a system of global free movement. That's obviously not going to happen overnight. It's not going to happen unilaterally. It would need to work with sort of regional free movement zones, for example, a bit like the EU. But I think it's increasingly clear that that is what's needed.
Thank you very much, Nadia. I've got another question here from somebody called Yak, who says, "What is the future of Islamophobia in UK politics?" You touched on it already, in the sense of the Conservative Party has not got to grip with its Islamophobia problem. Also, there are Labour MPs who have also, who've spoken out and said that they haven't received support, having suffered Islamophobic abuse as well. This is a problem that pervades all of society. What would you kind of say on that point?
I think that the failure of the Conservative Party to tackle Islamophobia is disgraceful, it's shameful. It's not surprising given the record of the Tory party, and I saw that kind of up close and ugly in a recent Westminster Hall debate on Islamophobia, where the minister opened her response to the debate talking about the terrorist who murdered Sir David Amess. And there were all sorts of other just shocking things that happened in that debate. But as you say, it's not a problem that's confined to the Conservative Party. It's a problem in all political parties and in wider society as well. So the Labour Party needs to publish the Ford report, and it needs to be serious about all forms of racism. And I'd also say that across different forms of racism, not enough is being done. We know that that's the case in the Tory party, but we should hold ourselves to a higher standard in the Labour Party. And I think, for example, on anti-Semitism, there still needs to be a programme of political education that prevents anti-Semitism. And years later, after the first sort of set of complaints were made, that still hasn't happened.
Yeah, so there's still work, much work to be done across the political spectrum. I absolutely agree with you on that. Thank you very much, Nadia. Patrik, I'm going to come to you now. You kind of focused on some very specific areas in this report to do with terrorism, to do with anti-trans hate, and also the growing kind of area of fascist fitness as well. I suppose I was wondering if you could just sort of give us a bit of analysis of these areas, or whichever ones of those you really want to kind of focus on particularly.
Sure. Thank you. Yeah, I haven't done as kind of I don't have as a wide kind of reaching kind of analysis here as Joe and Nadia has, and I've been looking more specifically at these topics that you're bringing up. So first of all, terrorism, I was gonna kind of spend most of my time on, I think. But I will also cover a little bit on some kind of trends in terms of targets of hate online and how kind of the far right has attempted to find new ways to organize, especially during the pandemic. Kind of following on some of the things that Joe said. And first of all, it's on terrorism. Over the last, or far right terrorism, far right violence and endorsement of violence by the far right. And there has been an upwards trend over the last couple of years, which I think many have kind of seen from a distance in terms of quite horrendous and large attacks across the world, because this is not a trend that is exclusive to the UK. It didn't start here. It's more something that the UK has been dragged into. Because this part of the movement is incredibly international, and we had attacks in the US and New Zealand, in Germany, in Norway. So this kind of covers a lot of the Western world. And this has had kind of knock-on effects. And the UK is more broadly is kind of following this. So since last year, we started to more kind of systematically count far-right terror-related convictions in the UK. So since 1997, about 25 years, we've counted 128 convictions. 76 of those are in the last 5 years. So that's almost 2/3, about 60%, in just a fifth of that time. So that's undeniably a rise. And separately from that, we're also seeing kind of a trend in who is convicted. The average age of the perpetrators have dropped significantly. It's now, in the last 5 years, 28 years, and 18 of these 76 convictions are teenagers, compared to just 6 in total in the previous 20 years. So there's something going on here. The question is this just an issue of increased attention by the police? Is it actually a good thing? We're finding people that weren't found before, that maybe in the early 2000s, these mostly young men were let to roam free, or they were kind of convicted under other forms of legislation, related to other forms of violence and such, but not political violence. And there is some of that. That is true. The police has put more emphasis on far-right violence. There's been a big effort to find them, and more of them are trialed under terror legislation. But it's not the whole story. At the same time, we have kind of a changing landscape in online organizing within the far right. And what we're seeing there is that it's moved to the internet. Especially these alternative social media platforms that Joe talked about before, that are largely unmoderated and largely anonymous, allows people to connect in a way they couldn't 20 years ago. It allows young people to participate in far groups in ways they couldn't before, because they don't have the means to travel, for example. Just because they are so young, they wouldn't be let in. But online, you can be anyone. And we've seen young people as young as 13, 14, pretending to be 20-year-olds in order to gain legitimacy and run groups themselves even. So kind of social media has allowed a broader range of people to get engaged. And then you spend time in these groups, and you gradually consume far-right propaganda, and kind of by the group pressure get radicalized and take action yourself, often not as part of a group, but as an individual. That this is what people kind of lazily call lone wolves, but they are really part of a network. But they might act on their own, but they are encouraged and supported and driven to it by a very close-knit and very active group of people online that they talk with probably every day. So this has kind of changed how you can engage, and this is also kind of an extension of the post-organizational element of the far right now. We're also seeing kind of a bit of a naivety in the far right. So part of the issue with online communities, especially when they're anonymous, is that there's an element of upmanship. You want to be more extreme, you want to say more outrageous things. It's sometimes called shit posting. You want to cause outrage as a form of entertainment. But in these groups, that's politicized and it's taken to a very extreme level. But this kind of communities and these kind of contexts where you are pushed to always be more extreme and kind of prove yourself as a real dedicated far-right activists kind of pushes people into kind of illegal territory. So you might share bomb-making material or bomb-making manuals rather, and instructions on how to build weapons and in order to show that you are really extreme. Rather than explicitly planning to do those things. So that's important to take into account here as well. There's also kind of a culture of sounding extreme, which is not necessarily exactly the same thing as actually carrying it out. But it does push you into over the line into illegal territories when you share manuals that can be useful for terrorism, and combined with police attention on it, that leads to more arrests. So that's one explanation, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't take this seriously. People from these groups have just in the last years, or in the last year, been arrested and convicted for planning and getting quite far in committing really violent acts. We have a very young guy planning to murder a classmate of his, and had gotten quite far in planning that. So it's still like a relevant, it's not something to kind of ignore as a form of rebellion by young people or something similar to that. It's very serious things. A young man, a 16-year-old, has a huge amount of potential to cause a lot of damage if he really wants to. It's no different really from a 20-year-old in that sense. So that's kind of where we are in terrorism right now. Just in the last couple of months, we've the first months of this year rather, we've already had several arrests and start of trials, which is not counted in these statistics I'm bringing up now, and there are many ongoing trials as well. And part of that trend, which is also worth mentioning, is kind of the focus on improvised weapons. This is in part inspired by the Halle shooting in Germany from 2019, who explicitly aimed to kind of show the viability of home-built weapons. The shooter there had built his own semi-automatic rifle that worked reasonably well. He killed 2 people, and he live streamed the attack, which kind of put an emphasis on this kind of phenomenon that you can build weapons yourself, because that's an issue in most of Europe, where access to weapons is not very easy compared to the US, for example. And next to this, we have a kind of an interest in 3D printed weapons, which is tricky, and also explosives, which are always kind of home constructed. So there's a lot of kind of worrying trends there, and part of this is this kind of online sphere where very extreme people can get in touch with each other and share tips and advice and radicalize each other. And at the same time, it's also about kind of a feeling that things are not moving fast enough, that the alt-right and Trump years that made them optimistic for a while, but ultimately it didn't change society at its core as much as they hoped it would, and therefore they grew impatient. Another kind of moving on then to kind of the fitness groups that I wrote about in this report as well. It's connected in the sense that it's also about an impatience with online activism and the feeling that they want to take action in some kind of more practical way. And what I mean by fitness groups, which is clearly not self-evident, is online communities which are far right ideologically, that bring in people with kind of the promise of helping each other to grow stronger physically and mentally, but primarily physically. So it's advice groups for how to go to the gym and what to eat and how to grow your muscles, which is by itself not necessarily far right, but these are because they combine these fitness advice and how to get fitter and healthier with extreme fascist ideology, far right texts, anti-Semitism, extreme racism of all sorts. And the danger is that it works ultimately. It's that the men who come into these groups, they do actually make improvements, they make friends, and they get stronger, they feel better, while at the same time being kind of fed far-right ideology. So they start to connect fascism with feeling better. And the way we see this is that during the pandemic, during COVID, it was difficult for the far right to organize. As we said before, they can't meet up, it's dangerous. They were it was illegal and so on. But to improve yourself physically, to go to the gym and share the kind of progress with people online, it's something practical. It's something you can do in the real world. And because fascism kind of visualizes and sees the health of the nation as the sum of the health of the individuals that make it up, you do something for your country, you do something for your race when you grow stronger. And this is an old fascist idea, this is nothing new. But combined with these kind of online community elements and COVID, it's been an increasing focus by the far right that's kind of attracted a lot of people. We've seen new people join through these groups, and we've seen them radicalize quite extremely. And separately from this, of course, is kind of the potential for violence that increases when they do these sorts of workouts, because it's also combined with actual kind of martial arts and that sort of thing. And we've seen groups practicing, small groups, 2-3 people going out in the forest and practicing beating each other up, essentially. And they talk about using that on their political opponents, which is part of this wider trend of accepting violence as a legitimate means to affect change.
Can I ask you a quick question on this?
Sure.
Hop in quickly. So one of the questions I have for this is there a sense in which there are members of specific groupings that are dominant in this scene, or does it not really work like that? Is it more kind of individuals looking for a group who go out and find this fitness community, or which way around does it work, if you see what I mean?
I think there's a lot of things that some of these kind of advertise themselves as a bit less political, and they can attract people from kind of a wide range. They just call themselves fitness something, local groups and so on, name of a town. Other ones are called literally fascist fitness, and they attract people that are already active in far-right chats. So I don't know if I answered your question now. You're muted.
Sorry, I'm on mute. Sorry. Do people share materials from, say, Patriotic Alternative and stuff in these groups?
Yeah.
Or
exactly. And then Patriotic Alternative, the group Joe talked about earlier, they are being very active in this sphere. They run their own group. They also do trainings themselves. That's part of their activism. They meet up and they do sort of boot campy trainings every couple of weeks.
Great.
So that's one of the important groups. But completely new groups have also sprung up, focusing explicitly on this. They kind of reject the politics and the activism and focus on the individual kind of physical change and say stuff like screw politics. Let's do push-ups, because they believe that by changing themselves, they can affect change in kind of their local community and so on.
I cut you up in full flow. So was there anything else you wanted to
No, I was just
touch on there
at
before we
the
go to
end
questions?
there. I think I can just go like quickly, because this I'm gonna try another segue here. But the last part here is that this is, of course, part of this has to do with the far right view on masculinity, of asserting masculinity and feeling that masculinity from the start is under threat and therefore needs to be asserted through building yourself into a stronger soldier, essentially. So to kind of counteract a feeling among the far right that their masculinity is threatened. So masculinity is really important. There's also a lot of kind of language of protecting their women and that sort of thing. So come back to extremely basic kind of fascist ideals. And the last thing I just want to mention is as well is trans hate, anti-trans hate, which we covered in an article as well, which is also related in that sense, that it's seen as a threat towards kind of society in a whole, but it's also something that they need to kind of the transgender movement is something they want to assert is different from themselves, to assert themselves as men, and therefore trans people become kind of the symbol of everything they are against, and therefore trans people and anything that doesn't align neatly into binary idea of gender becomes an extreme target of hate in these groups. So we've seen that overall in kind of far right groups online that like Nadia mentioned before, trans people are increasingly a target of hate. And this is publicly in terms of activism, comments on social media, campaigns. And there's a huge overlap there, of course, with more mainstream anti-trans rhetoric. But I would go like further and argue that it's not just a tactic to get mainstream attention. It is that as well. But the amount of anti-trans hate internally inside of these groups tells me that this is a genuine hate akin to the racism. We shouldn't kind of simplify it into a tactic. This is something I'm quite invested in because it clashes with their worldview quite harshly. So that's really worrying. We see quite a lot of kind of demonstrations where they're burning trans pride flags. We've had a few offline cases of attacks internationally. A lot of smaller things like removing stickers and so on around the UK as well. So that's something we're looking at quite a bit. I think that was everything I had for now.
Thanks, Patrik. Really good to hear some sort of more drill down in some of the detail of the report. And yeah, like Patrik says, I mean that you can go onto the report, you can read those articles. They're all there for you if you head to our website. I reckon we should take about 10 minutes, 10, 15 minutes just to answer a few questions, if that's okay. People can stick around. We've had some really interesting ones come through. There's a kind of trend I've seen in a few questions here about the transnational links, far right links. How powerful are the influences in British far right activism? We've had a question from a comrade in Brazil who's said that they're asking what can we suggest for transnational anti-fascist action to counter extremism in Brazil. let's just take a kind of broad overview here. What is the kind of state of the transnational far right links? How well connected are these groups? Anyone want to jump in on that?
I can jump
something
in.
for Joe.
Yeah, I can jump in on that. But so I think there's a couple of things here, right? One is a broad, if you place, obviously this report is our yearly report, so it looks at the UK over the last year, and so that's probably why we focused on it. But generally speaking, everything that we're seeing in the UK is part of a broader trend, right? And while it's an uneven trend, the rise of the global far right in the last two or so decades, or in fact, really, we might even go back to the end of the Cold War, is a long but uneven rise. And you mentioned a friend from Brazil with Bolsonaro, or Modi in India, or recently, of course, Trump in America. Or if we look across Europe and we see Le Pen in the front, or the National Rally in France, or the Sweden Democrats, or Vox in Spain has recently started doing better. We've seen the Alternative for Deutschland in Germany. We've seen the True Finns. We've seen, obviously, Orban in Hungary, and Law and Justice in Poland, and Liga in Italy. You can go on and on and on. While all of these parties are not necessarily on the rise at the moment, over a long period of time, if you look at it, there is a worrying trend, which I would argue, where the pillars of liberal democratic structures and norms are being eroded and wobbling, and we're seeing the rise of a more authoritarian, regressive thing. And it's a really useful reminder that I think many of us had perhaps wrongly or naively felt that the march of progress is one way, and we're seeing that in lots of places that is definitely not the case. And worryingly, each place where we essentially thought there was an exception, whether or not it was Germany because of its history and the way it had come so well to terms with Nazism, we wouldn't see the far right there. And now we have the AfD in parliamentary chambers. Sweden was an exception, and for many people in the literature, it's a liberal place, it's a lovely place, and it is. But we've seen the Sweden Democrats, we have elections in Sweden this year, that there's some real concern by people that we might see the Sweden Democrats work with the Conservative Party. That cordon sanitaire crumbling. Portugal was an exception because Salazar had been there and things had changed. Now we've seen Chega emerge in the last few years, And so all of the exceptions in our literature, unfortunately, aren't there anymore. And this is absolutely not saying that we're going to see some emergence of some fourth right and the whole world's about to end. I'm absolutely not saying that. And we've seen with things like the failure of Trump, etc. This is not a one-way road in either direction. But what it is saying, there is a direction of travel away from this presumption that liberal, progressive, social democracy, etc. was on the rise. We are seeing a direction of travel in lots of parts of the world that are deeply concerning. And outside of that, when you say how important is this transnationalism, I think it's fundamental. I mean, post 9/11, we've seen a number of far-right organizations or movements that are genuinely transnational in the way they consider themselves. And the anti-Muslim movement is a great example of this. Because of all of the wonderful things about the internet and the wonderful things about social media that we can use. I remember when we were campaigning against the identitarians in the Mediterranean, we were using social media to contact fishermen in North Africa and all those sorts of wonderful things it allows us to do. Those networks can also be used by them. We have these global networks within the far right now, where individuals can donate or micro donations of time or money or information or energy. And in some cases, what we see is we see whole movements and groupings emerge that are genuinely, in their conception of the threat, is either global or certainly European-wide or certainly Western-wide. And the external threat is Muslims and the internal threat is Muslims, however they conceive it, but they think across borders and they crowdsource their anger across borders. It's not just that you'll get a group sat in London posting away about how outrageous it is that there's halal chicken nuggets in Stoke. There will be crowdsourcing this anger about people putting up posts about halal chicken nuggets in Kiev, halal chicken nuggets in St. Johannesburg, Johannesburg or Rio de Janeiro. They will crowdsource this information and it goes into these super sharers that whips around the world. And essentially the information they can produce is many of these individuals then fired up because they believe there is either continental or even global crisis. Individuals now operate across borders. And I always go back to Le Pen after her last presidential run, where she thanks the online militants all over the world, right? And there's this kind of guy who comes in underneath and says, I just thought I was a shit poster in Australia and I didn't realize I was having such an impact, right? Because I was making content for the French election. These networks now, these information, the rhetoric and the use of tactics, etc., has these global networks that we all have for positive, but they can also be used for negative. And so that's why we often say hope not hate. Like we focus on British far right because we're based here, but we've done lots of work throughout movements that cross borders, because increasingly it no longer makes just sense to say what's happening on our street, what's happening in our community, or what's just happening in our country. Even though many of the far-right groupings will first and foremost be nationalist, there are whole groupings that think about these things globally or transnationally or Western-wide and things like that. There's always been elements of the far right that have done that, but the internet has allowed that to happen in a much more genuine sense. Transnational global networks of far-right activists operate every day, especially in the world that Patrik looks at with terrorism. And that's really, really worrying. And it's really, really hard to combat. It involves transnational collaboration of anti-fascists. It demands better transfer of information. When we talk about, the person from Brazil will know the Brazilian far right better than we will by a million times. And yet, so when the English are talking about Brazil, we need to be having those conversations, and vice versa. And the same goes for, we need genuine internationalism and collaboration between anti-fascist networks, because at the moment they are less global. And there's been some great work done this year by various groups on that, but we are still, I think, behind in the way they conceptualize the threat and collaborate every day, all day, in a way that I don't think we necessarily do as much progressively.
Here's a great question. Thanks for that, Joe, by the way. Here's a great question from Oliver, who says, what strategies do the panelists suggest for pushing back on conspiracy theories? How do we find ways to communicate to those that believe them, or is that pointless? And where are these movements most vulnerable? And I guess, is there something on that in the report that you can touch on? Nadia, perhaps you might want to tackle that question from a slightly different perspective of, doorstep campaigning with the Labour Party. What happens when you have a conversation like that on the doorstep? How do you kind of navigate that? Whoever wants to jump in on that question, please feel free.
Thanks. I'll jump in. So I've had quite a few of these conversations, particularly around COVID and vaccinations. People who approach me at my surgeries or in the street, but also occasionally on the doorstep. And the way that I deal with it, I think it's quite difficult, because it's a fine line between listening to what someone's saying, but also being clear about what you think, because I think the last thing that you should do is kind of give an inch to this kind of stuff. So I always say, and part of this answer, I guess, is particular to me as a representative, but I'll genuinely listen to what they're saying and empathise with them, because the feelings that they feel are real, their fear is real, the isolation that they often feel is very real. And then I'll say, kind of, I understand why you would feel like this, especially because of this, or whatever, and then say, I have a different view. I think this, and this is. I do think it's important to introduce evidence, but I think it's also important to remember that people will probably be more swayed by the kind of emotional argument and values-based argument generally, rather than statistics. And then I kind of say, I understand that we have a difference here, but I'm sure you'd rather have a representative who is kind of straight talking and says when I disagree and says when I agree, rather than just telling you what I think you want to hear.
Yeah, definitely that thing of respecting the person and not necessarily the opinion, I think is absolutely vital. It's something that we have a difficult conversations workshop, which my colleague Owen runs a lot in the education and training department, and that's kind of at the core, really. It's trying to give those space, give some space for those kind of discussions in a one-to-one environment. Joe, you've unmuted. Are you jumping in on this as well?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, just to agree, I think what Nadia's saying is absolutely right, in the sense that the worst thing to do, all the research suggests, is to turn around and don't be ridiculous. How stupid of you to think that,
Yeah.
And trying to find some sort of either kernel of truth in there or some element of common ground for discussion. But I'm not an expert on de-radicalization. We've actually just starting a project at the moment where we've hired a de-radicalization caseworker, and as well in the research team, my colleagues Gregory and David do a lot of work around the conspiracy theories. The only thing I'd add to what's been said is, when you get to these super conspiracies I was mentioning, where people believe there is like a grand conspiracy at play, some sort of secret cabal running the world, people are obviously more susceptible to the belief that there is a secret cabal running the world if they feel powerless, right? if they believe as individuals they cannot affect change, or that their experience of our democracy is that they cannot affect change, they're more likely to believe when someone says, well, of course you can't affect any change, it's completely normal, the whole world's run by a secret cabal and politicians have no say in that. And they turn around and go, well, that makes sense because I feel completely powerless and I don't think I can affect any change. And so things like localism and empowering communities and individuals so that they can see the effective change that they can make at a local level means it's less likely when someone turns around and says, the whole world is run by a secret cabal and you have no ability to affect that. And they turn around and say, well, I don't feel that. I feel that I can affect change myself or my community can affect change or whatever it is. So part of it as well has to be putting people in a position where they feel less powerless and as a result less likely to believe when someone says you have no power, and that's part of it, I think.
Yeah, that's two really great responses there from Nadia and Joe. We've got a few minutes left. I reckon 5 minutes. So let's rattle through a few questions here and let's try and give some, there's some meaty topics which we could spend a long time on. So let's try and keep the answers as brief as we can. First question that I'm going to fire at all of you is from Andy, who asks about the fragility of the US political system. Really interesting question here, which kind of ends with, do we have any predictions for what's going to happen in the US over the next few years in the run up to the presidential election? Are we going to see a Trump a resurgence? Is he going to stand again? What's the general thoughts on that? Any predictions? No, making political predictions these days is a fool's game, right? So maybe we don't want to make any predictions on that. Joe, you got a...
Well, no, it's because you're recording it. This is the problem. It'll get dug out when we get it wrong, won't it? There's definitely certain things like the radicalization of the Republican Party that Trump or Trumpism without Trump, whether or not he stands, we'll see. The room. I can make a blind guess, and he's launching a new podcast, and he still seems to hint at things and all those things. But whether or not he does, I think there's still questions about the effect that the movement has had on the Republican Party and the radicalization of that party, and where its politics now are, say, versus 10 years ago. That even without him being there and running at the next election, I think there's a question about is that a radical right party now, and the politics that it espouses are concerning with or without him at the next election. I think so. It's not just about Trump now. That I think Trumpism without Trump, if you will, it is an option even without him.
Yeah, it's a great answer. Question here from Anonymous. Are most far-right activists men? I've seen several middle-aged women become radicalized through the anti-COVID vaccine conspiracy community. Could one of you speak to that a little bit? Like, how's the dynamics of kind of far-right activism changed over the last couple of years?
Sure. No. No. The answer is no. They're not all men. In short, but men are definitely overrepresented in organized groups. That's definitely true. I think I don't have specific numbers, and it varies across the movement, different sorts of groups. But you have women in the very most extreme groups. You have, for example, Take National Action, which is a proscribed Nazi group, is probably the most extreme you can get in this area. You have women in that, and you have women in something like For Britain, for example, is run by a woman. So women plays an important role in the far right. I think women got a more important role and a growing role during kind of the rise of social media, because it's a different form of activism. Their kind of followers are largely male, but they got a huge success on Instagram and YouTube and that sort of thing. I think different groups, women have a different kind of size of the role. These fitness groups, for example, that I talked about before, women play a very little role, because at the core of these things, much of far right kind of activism relates to kind of feeling of fragile masculinity and the need to protect that. Therefore, it attracts more men. but that's not the whole explanation, and lots of other parts of it attracts women.
Thank you very much for that, Patrik. Another question here from Eleanor, who says, I'm still holding out hope for electoral reform involving some version of PR. Does the panel think that PR presents more of a risk or more of an opportunity for dealing with the far right in this country? I've paraphrased that slightly, Eleanor, but I hope I've got the gist of your question there. But thank you for that. It's a really good question. Nadia, what do you reckon about that one?
I'm a big supporter of PR. I think it's really important as a first step to reforming our democracy and deepening democracy. I don't think that should just be confined to elections. I think it should also be in our workplaces, in our communities. But at the moment, under the current electoral system, not only does it massively favour the Tories, and I think is it 14 out of 15 elections that have been won by the Tories under PR, or a similar statistic. Don't quote me on that, but people can look up the exact figure. And at the moment, under first past the post, it effectively means that millions of people are denied a voice, because if you live in a so-called safe seat, then your vote effectively doesn't count, and then it disproportionately skews the focus and the kind of national conversation towards marginal seats, and they have a disproportionate voice. So, for example, in Nottingham East, I have almost a 17,500 majority. My neighbouring seat in Gedling was always, during my lifetime, a Labour seat, but has recently switched to Tory by a few hundred votes. And that effectively means, under first past the post, that voters in Gedling have more of a say over the election result than voters in Nottingham East. And that's not fair. And I think even if a proportional system would result in more fringe groups and fringe candidates being represented, which it almost certainly will, then I still think that's a good thing, because I think people have a right to be politically represented when they vote. And I also think that it's far better to be holding to account those views and exposing them in Parliament and through the political institutions that we have, rather than them already receiving a massive hearing in the media.
We've had thanks, Nadia. We've had an interesting kind of comment, a couple of comments in the chat here from different parts of the UK. We've got Jenny up in Scotland, who said that they've had PR, but haven't had any far right parties winning elections that way so far. And then over in Wales, Kerwin has said that they've got some form of PR in the Welsh Parliament, and it has led to some far right groups in the Senedd, like UKIP. But at the same time, Welsh public voted them out last May, so it can work both ways, says Kerwin. So, yeah, interesting.
I completely agree, and I think as well that even if far right parties do win, that's not a reason not to have a better democracy. That's a failure on us as much as it is a victory for far right parties. In the world of politics and in any democracy, you have to out-organise people, and if you don't, then that's what happens.
Yeah, well said. I'm going to move on to the one last question here, if that's okay. And it's from Leanne, who says, Cas Muda suggests that we should be cautious about entrenching people in a subculture at a young age by permanently labeling them as extremists or ideologically fixed. Do you think that age plays a part, and therefore, do you think that education and the curriculum is key in unpicking some of this stuff? What does the panel think about that?
I'll just quick. No, but I agree. I think it's quite clear. I mean, there's a lot to think about in terms of what we do with like terrorists, especially kind of custodial sentences. Does that actually de-radicalize people? How does that work? Because it's kind of the easy solution. Even though they don't get generally that long sentences, they will kind of carry that with them. And in some cases, I think it's entirely, it's not much, we don't have much else to do. We have to stop them somehow. but to just do custodial sentences and leave it at that is not enough. I mean, I hope and hate we believe that people change, and we started a de-radicalization program for that reason. We do schoolwork for that reason. So I think we're not going to stop this trend of young people going into and kind of accepting far-right violence through incarcerations, I think.
I would absolutely echo what Patrik has said. I mean, I used to be a hate crime worker, and although I've got big criticisms of hate crime as kind of an idea and a framework and an ethos of approaching these social problems, I think that education is primarily the method that this should be targeted by, either, well, both preventative and rehabilitative. And I'm just very skeptical of incarceration as a method of preventing or dealing with kind of far right or any extremist ideology.
Yeah, I mean, this is something we've spoken about a lot as well, and I think that's something that that we share on the panel. I reckon let's bring it to a close there. Nadia, Joe, Patrik, thank you so much. We've had people in the comments asking what can we do. As Joe said in his kind of overview at the start, we're going to be gearing up for an election fight. So please keep your eyes on your emails. You'll be getting information about that. So we need you to join that if you want to get out and do something about that. Otherwise, thank you very, very much to all three of the panelists. Thank you to everybody who tuned in this evening to come and listen. And I hope you found it interesting and informative. And hope to see you at another Hope Not Hate event very, very soon. Thanks a lot, everybody. Take care.
Thanks so much, everyone. Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Yeah, cheers for coming.
Bye.
Bye.